I moved into the apartment in early March. It was small but cheap, with a single bedroom and narrow kitchen, and a living room with a large window that overlooked a quiet street. The building was older, with creaking floors and thin walls. I had been alone in my previous apartments and thought I was used to the noises of an old place. But this one felt different from the start. The first strange thing I noticed was a doll that sat in the corner of the living room, propped against the wall on the floor. It was a porcelain doll with wide, glassy eyes and a soft body that allowed it to sit upright. Its clothes were faded and slightly dusty, and its hair was matted like it had been there for decades. The previous tenant had left it behind, and I assumed it was just part of the clutter. I never thought much about it at first. The first night I heard it was around 2 a.m. I was lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint whimper. I froze, thinking it was a cat outside or the wind brushing the window frame. But the sound repeated a few seconds later, softer at first, then slightly louder, like a child crying lightly. I dismissed it as imagination, or maybe the heating system shifting pipes. The second night, I was awakened by it again. I thought I was dreaming until I rolled over and noticed the doll, slightly angled, as though it had turned toward the room. I sat up slowly and realized its head was facing in my direction. I had left it facing the wall. I stared at it, and the sound stopped. The next day, I cleaned the apartment, dusting every surface, including the doll. I adjusted it to face the wall again and told myself I would ignore it. I tried to rationalize the sound as creaking from the floor or my own imagination, but deep down I knew that dolls do not cry, and yet the sound was unmistakable and human-like. Over the next few nights, the crying became more distinct and more deliberate. It was never a full wail, but a soft sob that seemed to start as I passed by the living room. Each time I looked up, the doll's head was slightly turned, as if it had noticed me moving. Its eyes seemed to glimmer in the light of the lamp, casting an unnatural shine. I tried to avoid looking directly at it, but I could feel its presence as I walked past. I began recording video and audio to prove to myself that I was imagining it. The first few recordings showed nothing. The doll sat perfectly still, and the files played back silent. The third night, however, I captured a faint whimper during a walk past the living room. I froze in place. The sound was faint but distinct and synchronized perfectly with my movement, as though the doll knew when I would approach. I tried removing it, placing it in the closet, but when I returned later in the evening, it was back in the corner, the head slightly angled toward the room, the eyes glimmering faintly in the lamplight. I began sleeping with the living room lights on and tried to avoid the space entirely, but sometimes when passing I would hear a wet sniffle or a soft whimper that sent chills down my spine. By the end of the first week, I noticed other subtle things. The doll would lean slightly forward as if anticipating my presence. The floor beneath it showed faint scuff marks like it had been moved the night before, and sometimes I could swear the hair shifted slightly as though a breeze had passed through. Though no window or vent was open, the air around the corner of the room seemed colder and heavier. When I approached, I started keeping a notebook, recording every sound, every movement, every subtle shift of the doll. Each night, the crying came more deliberately. When I walked past, my pulse quickened and my stomach churned with dread. The presence of the doll was no longer benign. I could feel it watching my every step in the room and waiting for me to pass so it could cry again. I stopped inviting anyone over. The cat refused to approach the doll and would hiss if I walked toward the living room. In the evening, the apartment that had seemed quaint and manageable now felt oppressive and alive in a way I could not explain. I was beginning to fear a simple walk across the room, because the doll would always cry, and that was only the beginning. By the second week, The crying had begun to evolve. It no longer occurred only when I walked past the living room, but sometimes as I sat at the kitchen table, or even when I was lying on the couch reading. The sound was faint at first, just a soft whimper that I could convince myself was part of the old building settling, but gradually it grew more deliberate and more recognizable as the sound of a small child crying. I started noticing patterns. The doll seemed to respond to my movement and my attention. If I lingered in one part of the room, it would cry less, but the moment I turned my back or walked away, the sobbing would start and stop again with precision, as though it were waiting for me to trigger it. I tried testing this by walking past slowly and deliberately stopping at points along the floor, but each time the crying started exactly when I passed the corner where the doll sat. I attempted to remove it again, placing it in a closet several rooms away, or even the bathtub. At one point, did nothing. When I returned the next day, it was always back in the same corner, head slightly tilted toward the center of the room, eyes wide and glinting faintly in the lamplight. I began to record everything with my phone and a cheap audio recorder, but the files would always play back normal until I approached the corner during playback. Then a faint sobbing would emerge from the speakers, synchronized with my movement in the room. I began to dread the living room. I could feel the air shift as I entered the space. It became colder and heavier. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked under no weight, and the lamp would sometimes flicker subtly. Just as the soft whimper began, I could sense it watching me. Even when I wasn't in the room, I would hear faint sniffles from the corner and sometimes a scraping sound as if it were moving slowly along the floor. While I was elsewhere the first night, it truly terrified me. I was walking toward the window to close it, and the sound of crying began softly. As expected, I froze, and the doll shifted slightly forward, as though leaning toward me. Then the sobbing grew louder, almost desperate, and the air around me became oppressively cold. My heart pounded. I could see my breath in the light of the lamp, and when I stepped back, the doll's head was tilted so sharply it seemed impossibly unnatural. I tried speaking to it. I whispered that it had to stop, that I was alone and no one else was in the apartment. It was a strange reflex. I do not understand, to address it as though it were sentient. The sobbing increased in intensity for a few seconds, then abruptly stopped. The doll sat still in the corner, but the sense of being watched did not diminish. I could feel the presence waiting, lingering in the room like a weight pressing against the walls. After that night, I began keeping the lights on in the living room continuously. I refused to walk past the doll and often detoured across the kitchen or through other areas to avoid entering the corner. It became difficult to sleep. I would lie awake listening for faint whimpers that seemed to start even when I wasn't moving. The cat refused to enter the apartment at night and hid under the bed or behind furniture. I noticed other things as well, small details that I had ignored before. The doll's eyes glimmered in ways that caught my attention, almost imperceptibly, and the tilt of the head would change subtly each time I looked away. I began to feel a creeping dread before even entering the room, as though I were anticipating an attack from something unseen but fully present. The weight in the air and the faint damp scent that sometimes accompanied the sobbing made me feel nauseous. I tried explaining it to friends, but I could not bring myself to bring anyone into the apartment at night. The thought of someone else witnessing it terrified me. I tried cleaning the corner around the doll, removing dust and rearranging furniture, but nothing worked. The sobbing continued with precision, and the doll always returned to its corner, head slightly turned as if observing me. By the end of the second week, I had stopped trying to remove it entirely. I began to study the sounds and record them, meticulously noting the times they occurred, the volume and intensity, and even the subtle changes in tone. It was as if the doll were learning, observing, and responding to me with increasing awareness. The crying no longer felt random, but intentional, deliberate, almost communicating a presence that was not merely mechanical or accidental. The apartment had begun to feel claustrophobic. I could not relax in any room because the sobbing would start without warning. The walls seemed to hum faintly when I entered the living room, and the air grew thick as if pressing against me. I began to feel trapped in my own home, and the doll had become the center of its control. I no longer walked past it without hesitation, and every movement I made was accompanied by the awareness of its gaze, waiting, crying, watching, and I knew, even then, that this was only the beginning. By the third week, I had begun to notice something impossible. The doll no longer stayed perfectly in its corner. It was subtle, at first a fraction of an inch forward or a slight tilt of the head that I could swear had not been there when I last looked. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, but the precision of its movements was unmistakable. One night, I had left the living room to get water from the kitchen. I returned 10 minutes later, and Froze the doll was now angled slightly toward the doorway, as if it had shifted to watch me approach. Its glassy eyes seemed to glint with awareness in the lamplight. The soft sobbing began the instant I stepped into the room, perfectly synchronized with my movement. My pulse raced. I could feel a weight in the air pressing down as though it were alive. I began documenting the shifts with video cameras. I set one in the corner of the living room, aimed directly at the doll, another on a tripod across the room. I reviewed the footage the next day with disbelief. The cameras showed the doll stationary in every frame, yet when I watched the live footage at night on the phone, it would be leaning slightly forward, tilting its head subtly, or even rotating its body by a fraction of a degree as I entered the room. It was impossible and yet undeniable. The crying had become more persistent. It followed me throughout the apartment. The sound would emerge faintly from corners I had not entered or from rooms where the doll was not present. It was as if the doll had learned to project its presence into the air itself. I would walk down the hall and hear the faint rasp of sobbing behind me, turning to see nothing, yet feeling the unmistakable weight of attention pressing from every direction. The first confrontation occurred when I tried to remove it completely. I picked it up and carried it to the balcony. It was a cold evening, and I assumed the fresh air would neutralize whatever presence was attached to it. I placed the doll on a ledge and looked down at the street below, certain that it would remain outside. I returned inside and tried to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by the soft whimpering in the apartment. The sound was different this time, more urgent and louder. I went to the balcony, and Froze the doll was no longer on the ledge. It was back in the living room corner, head tilted slightly as if observing me. Its hair shimmered faintly in the dim light the way I had never seen before. The crying continued in perfect synchronization with my presence, as though mocking my attempt to remove it. From that point on, I could not escape the living room at night. The doll's movement became more pronounced. Sometimes I would glance toward the corner and see it sitting at a slightly different angle than I had left it just moments before. My own footsteps seemed to trigger subtle shifts in its posture. It was learning me, anticipating my actions, and responding in real time. I tried communicating with it. I whispered at it, asked why it followed me, what it wanted, but there was no answer, only the sobbing, wet and soft, following me across the floor, as if it were a living being attached to my every step. I began to dread Moving within my own apartment, small things escalated the floor beneath the doll, occasionally bore faint scuff marks suggesting it had been moved. I would see hair slightly displaced, as if brushed by an invisible hand occasionally. I felt the sensation of cold fingers graze my ankle. When I walked past the living room, even though nothing was there, the presence became more intelligent. I began noticing the crying would stop if I froze in place, and resume if I moved. My anxiety heightened as I realized it could observe and respond to my behavior in real time. The apartment felt suffocating and alive in a way I could not explain. I could no longer sleep in the living room without leaving every light on the sobbing wood. Emerge from corners or from behind furniture where the doll was not physically present. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. By the end of the third week, I understood the full scope of its control. I could not walk across the room without feeling the air press against me. The temperature dropped slightly, and the soft, wet sobbing began. The doll no longer needed to be touched or moved. It had become a central focus of a presence that existed beyond its porcelain body. It could manipulate the room subtly yet convincingly, and had learned to anticipate my every action. I was no longer living in my apartment. I was coexisting with something that had claimed it entirely, and it was learning how to dominate me. Part 5. The doll knows me. By the fifth week, the doll had begun interacting with me in ways I could not explain. It was no longer simply sitting in its corner or crying when I walked by. It had learned my habits and patterns. I could feel it anticipating my movements, responding before I even approached its corner. Every step I took, every glance toward the living room, it seemed to know. The sobbing would start just as I thought of walking past it, stopping when I paused or turned my attention elsewhere. I began to notice subtle physical changes in the apartment. Objects shifted slightly when I was away. Books would be stacked differently. Small items moved from shelves to the floor. Even the cushions on the couch altered in placement. Sometimes I would find the blanket I slept under in the living room draped unnaturally, shaped as if an invisible figure had lain beneath it. It was learning the contours of the room, the exact locations I frequented. One night, I awoke to the soft sobbing directly beside me. I had been sleeping in the living room with a mattress pushed against the wall. The doll was supposed to be across the room in its corner, barricaded with furniture. My heart pounded as I realized the sound was coming from my immediate vicinity. I sat up slowly, shining the flashlight toward the corner. The doll's eyes glinted faintly in the light, impossibly close, head tilted unnaturally toward me. The sobbing was wet, deliberate, almost pleading, and it mirrored my own shallow breaths. I tried to remove it again. I grabbed it and took it to the balcony, intending to throw it down. My hands shook violently as I placed it on the ledge. I returned inside and tried to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened to a chilling sound. The sobbing had returned, louder, desperate. I ran to the balcony and froze. The doll was gone. I turned back to the living room corner, and there it sat, perfectly upright, head cocked slightly as if mocking me. My pulse raced, and the air felt heavy and damp. It had returned, without explanation. The presence had grown beyond the physical doll. I would feel cold brushes against my ankle or wrist when walking past the living room, even if I had not approached the corner. The sobbing followed me into other rooms now, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes I would glance at the doll from my bedroom and swear I saw its head twist slightly, following my movements, even though I had left it in a fixed position. The psychological toll was severe. I could not sleep for more than an hour at a time. I could not eat properly. I could not leave the apartment without fear of what it would do in my absence. Even recording devices failed to capture the true horror. Video showed a still doll, audio often corrupted at the precise moments when the sobbing became most pronounced. It was as if it could manipulate reality itself to avoid being documented, or at least to mock me with my inability to prove its actions. By the end of the week, I realized I was living in a constant state of anticipation. Every movement triggered a potential response. The air felt heavy and damp. The walls seemed to press inward. The doll's eyes glimmered faintly no matter where I placed it. I could feel its attention like a weight pressing against my skin, a cold, wet sensation that crawled along my body in the quiet moments. I could hear the soft, deliberate sobbing in my mind, even when I left the living room entirely. It was no longer a mere object. It had become an intelligent, aware entity, shaping the apartment around itself and training me to live in fear. My perception of time had become fractured. Seconds felt like hours when passing the living room. Every glance toward its corner caused my heart to race. Every step I took seemed to be anticipated, mirrored, or judged by the presence. I knew with certainty that the doll had learned me. Every habit, every route, every small motion had been studied and now triggered its response. It no longer waited passively. It acted deliberately, claiming my space, anticipating my reactions, dictating how I moved, how I breathed, and how I existed within my own apartment. I had become a prisoner of my own home, and the doll was the warden. If you want, I can continue with part 6, the final part, where the doll reaches its full terrifying potential, directly confronting the narrator in an unavoidable and permanently life-altering way. By the 4th week, the doll's influence had grown far beyond subtle movements or synchronized, sobbing. The apartment itself began to feel like it was bending around its presence. The air was thick and heavy in certain corners, even when no doors were closed, and the temperature dropped sharply around the living room, where the doll sat waiting. Its sobbing would echo faintly even in other rooms, growing louder when I approached areas I did not expect. One evening I returned from the kitchen to find the furniture slightly displaced. The couch was angled a few inches closer to the wall. The coffee table shifted subtly, and the doll sat upright with its head turned fully toward me. Despite having faced the wall minutes before, I swore I had left it in the same spot. My pulse raced, and my hand shook. I recorded video immediately, but, as always, the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. Yet when I watched it live, even through the camera feed, I could see the subtle movements, the tilt of its head, the faint shifts of its body, as if it were tracking me. The crime became more interactive. It no longer happened at random intervals, but in response to my movements and my thoughts. I would think about leaving the living room, and the sobbing would start just as I stepped toward the doorway, stopping when I froze in place. It was learning not just my habits, but my intent, responding to mental cues that I could not control. The thought of walking across the room filled me with dread. Objects began to react around it. Small items left on the floor would occasionally appear next to the doll when I returned. A cup left on the coffee table would tilt slightly. A pen would roll toward the corner. Sometimes I would glance at the window ledge, and items I had placed there to block its movement would be moved. The air itself felt like it had weight, pushing slightly against me as I moved past the living room. The first direct confrontation occurred one night When I dared to approach the doll with a flashlight, I stepped slowly, trying to measure my courage against the intensity of the presence. The sobbing started almost immediately, soft, wet, almost desperate, and the doll shifted forward slightly, unnaturally, tilting its head at an impossible angle. I tried to grab it. The moment my fingers touched the porcelain, the air around me thickened as though the room itself had become viscous. The lamp flickered violently, and the sobbing grew louder, almost piercing. Vibrating through my skull, I recoiled and fell back onto the couch, heart racing. The doll had shifted again, its head now pointed directly in my face, even though I'd been several feet away moments before. I could feel a strange pressure emanating from it, a sensation of cold, wet fingers brushing across my skin without contact. The sobbing continued in perfect synchronization with my own breathing, mimicking it, mocking it. After that night, I stopped leaving the living room entirely. I barricaded the doorway with chairs and cushions, trying to contain whatever intelligence the doll had become. Yet the sobbing followed me. I could hear it faintly from the bedroom, the kitchen, even when I walked down the hall. It was no longer confined to its corner. The doll itself became the epicenter of a presence that could manipulate the environment and the air around me. The apartment became hostile. I could not relax in any room because the sobbing would start without warning. I would feel the faint weight of pressure behind me or a soft brush along my ankle. Occasionally, the doll would appear in my peripheral vision where I knew it could not physically be, yet its presence was undeniable, oppressive, almost sentient. The air smelled faintly damp and metallic, as if soaked in some unseen substance. By the end of the 4th week, I was a prisoner in my own home. Every movement, every sound, every glance at the doll filled me with dread. It had learned to control not just the living room, but the apartment itself. My sleep was shattered, my appetite gone, my nerves frayed. I could no longer tell whether the sobbing was a sound or a premonition, whether the pressure in the air was a trick of my mind or a physical force, and I realized with crushing certainty that this was not just a haunted doll. It was intelligent, patient, and persistent. It had begun to dominate my reality, shaping the apartment around its presence and training me to live in fear. By the 5th week, the doll had begun interacting with me in ways I could not explain. It was no longer simply sitting in its corner or crying when I walked by. It had learned my habits and patterns. I could feel it anticipating my movements, responding before I even approached its corner. Every step I took, every glance toward the living room, it seemed to know. The sobbing would start just as I thought of walking past it, stopping when I paused or turned my attention elsewhere. I began to notice subtle physical changes in the apartment. Objects shifted slightly when I was away. Books would be stacked differently. Small items moved from shelves to the floor. Even the cushions on the couch altered in placement. Sometimes I would find the blanket I slept under in the living room draped unnaturally, shaped as if an invisible figure had lain beneath it. It was learning the contours of the room, the exact locations I frequented. One night, I awoke to the soft sobbing directly beside me. I had been sleeping in the living room with a mattress pushed against the wall. The doll was supposed to be across the room in its corner, barricaded with furniture. My heart pounded as I realized the sound was coming from my immediate vicinity. I sat up slowly, shining the flashlight toward the corner. The doll's eyes glinted faintly in the light, impossibly close, head tilted unnaturally toward me. The sobbing was wet, deliberate, almost pleading, and it mirrored my own shallow breaths. I tried to remove it again. I grabbed it and took it to the balcony, intending to throw it down. My hands shook violently as I placed it on the ledge. I returned inside and tried to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened to a chilling sound. The sobbing had returned, louder, desperate. I ran to the balcony and froze. The doll was gone. I turned back to the living room corner, and there it sat, perfectly upright, head cocked slightly, as if mocking me. My pulse raced, and the air felt heavy and damp. It had returned, without explanation. The presence had grown beyond the physical doll. I would feel cold brushes against my ankle or wrist when walking past the living room, even if I had not approached the corner. The sobbing followed me into other rooms now, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes I would glance at the doll from my bedroom and swear I saw its head twist slightly, following my movements, even though I had left it in a fixed position. The psychological toll was severe. I could not sleep for more than an hour at a time. I could not eat properly. I could not leave the apartment without fear of what it would do in my absence. Even recording devices failed to capture the true horror. Video showed a still doll, audio often corrupted at the precise moments when the sobbing became most pronounced. It was as if it could manipulate reality itself to avoid being documented, or at least to mock me with my inability to prove its actions. By the end of the week, I realized I was living in a constant state of anticipation. Every movement triggered a potential response. The air felt heavy and damp. The walls seemed to press inward. The doll's eyes glimmered faintly no matter where I placed it. I could feel its attention like a weight pressing against my skin, a cold, wet sensation that crawled along my body in the quiet moments. I could hear the soft, deliberate sobbing in my mind, even when I left the living room entirely. It was no longer a mere object. It had become an intelligent, aware entity, shaping the apartment around itself and training me to live in fear. My perception of time had become fractured. Seconds felt like hours when passing the living room. Every glance toward its corner caused my heart to race. Every step I took seemed to be anticipated, mirrored, or judged by the presence. I knew with certainty that the doll had learned me. Every habit, every route, every small motion had been studied and now triggered its response. It no longer waited passively. It acted deliberately, claiming my space, anticipating my reactions, dictating how I moved, how I breathed, and how I existed within my own apartment. I had become a prisoner of my own home, and the doll was the warden. By the 6th week, I was no longer sure where I ended and where the doll began. It had learned every movement, every glance, every subtle twitch of my body. I felt it in the air around me, in the weight pressing against my skin, in the faint dampness that followed me from room to room. The apartment was no longer mine. It had become its domain, and I was the one being observed, studied, and trapped. One night, I awoke to the sobbing directly beside me. I had been lying on the mattress in the living room, barricading myself from the corner where the doll sat. My eyes opened slowly, and I froze. The doll was inches from my face, head tilted unnaturally, eyes glimmering with awareness. Its mouth was slightly open, the faintest hint of moisture on the porcelain lips. The sobbing was wet, deliberate, almost pleading, and it synchronized perfectly with my own shallow breaths. I tried to move. My limbs felt impossibly heavy, as if the air itself had become viscous. Every inch I attempted to lift was met with resistance, and the sobbing grew louder, echoing through my skull. I realized then that it had not only learned my habits, but had begun to manipulate my body, guiding me, restraining me, controlling my movements subtly yet completely. I attempted to throw the doll from the balcony again, my hands trembling violently as I grasped it. When I returned inside, I found it waiting in its corner, head cocked toward me, eyes glimmering. The sobbing had followed me across the apartment, faint at first, but rapidly growing louder until it was a chorus of wet, desperate cries that seemed to vibrate through every surface of the apartment. I began speaking to it, pleading, demanding it stop, trying to reason with a porcelain figure that had become a sentient force. The sobbing responded, accelerating, imitating panic, growing in intensity as though mocking my words. The air in the apartment thickened, heavy and damp, pressing against my chest. I could feel the sensation of wet fingers brushing along my skin, cold and insistent, moving with a precision no human could replicate. Sleep was impossible. Movement was terror. Every step I took, every glance I dared to cast toward the corner, elicited a response. The doll no longer needed to be visible to control the room. I could hear the sobbing echoing from empty corners, feel its presence pressing into my skin, and see its reflection in windows or mirrors for fleeting moments, even when it was nowhere near. One night, exhausted and desperate, I tried to flee. I opened the apartment door and ran into the hallway. Silence, relief, freedom. But when I turned back, the apartment window caught my eye. Inside, in the living room corner, the doll sat perfectly upright, head tilted toward me, eyes glimmering faintly. The sobbing had ceased, but I felt it in my chest, in my bones, in the air around me. It was waiting, always waiting. Days passed, and I returned cautiously. The apartment appeared normal, the doll in its corner, furniture in place, but the atmosphere was unbearable. The faint, damp smell lingered, the air pressed heavily against me, and sometimes, just at the edge of my perception, I could hear the soft, wet sobbing again, synchronized with my own breathing, just a whisper, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. I no longer sleep. I do not walk freely. I have stopped inviting anyone over. Even my cat refuses to enter the living room, hissing at a corner where no human could possibly be. The doll has become more than an object. It is intelligence, observation, presence. It watches, it waits, and it mirrors me in subtle, horrifying ways. My reflection, my own breathing, my own actions sometimes feel wrong, as if the doll is within me, anticipating my every move. I write this now because I fear what comes next. I feel it expanding its influence, learning to occupy more than just the room, more than just the apartment. I can feel its presence even outside, lingering at the threshold, waiting for me to return. The sobbing is never far away, sometimes just a whisper, sometimes loud enough to vibrate through my chest. It is patient, deliberate, unrelenting, and it knows me completely. I have realized one terrifying truth. I am no longer the observer. I am the observed. And the doll, its eyes glimmering in the corner, head tilted slightly toward me, is patient. It is waiting for the moment it can take the next step to merge completely with my reality, my body, my mind. And when it does, I fear there will be no escape. The sobbing never stops.